In this tutorial, we're going to have a look at using audio effects plugins in Live. Particularly, we're going to look at which plugins will be most suitable for a DJ set, how you can load them in, where you can find them, and things like that. We're not going to go too deep because there are a lot of plugins and some of them are really quite complex. So it would take a whole series just to cover them and do them justice. In fact, possibly even 2 series. So there is a lot there. So really what I'm going to just do is point you in the direction of where you can go through and listen to some of them yourself and how to go about doing that. So to start with, there's a couple of things probably to understand, and that is that there's 2 different main types of effects, or at least the way you use the effects, and that is as insert effects, which means you insert them on the track, just like we see here. You have individual plugins inserted on the track. And then send effects, which make use of these knobs here, the sends, which will only be visible if this button is yellow, and the return tracks, which likewise are only visible if that R button is enabled. So these are the return tracks here. And basically what happens is the return tracks are just like audio tracks in that you just load plugins onto them. They receive audio from these send controls. So you send from the track to those return tracks. So you can't actually have clips on the return tracks. All they do is receive audio from these sends. And one of the main benefits of that is that you can use the same effect on 2 different tracks. You can send from both of these tracks to the return tracks. And it's really useful for performance because you can sort of just bring it in for a short time. For example, if you just wanted to bring in a delay for just the snare, then you can just turn it up and turn it down again. It's kind of really useful for performance in that way, and it's kind of more expressive. And likewise, you can have a little bit of reverb on this track and a lot of reverb on that track, vice versa. So it just kind of opens up the control options. And also, it can save CPU because you're only using the one effect. Because otherwise, if you were doing it as an insert, you'd need to put a reverb on every single track that you wanted one. So that's kind of one of the main benefits of send effects. One thing you need to consider though when using send effects is that you're already getting a dry signal from the audio tracks themselves. And so when you're sending to the return tracks, you don't want any dry signal coming from the return tracks. All you want is wet signal. So just the effects basically. So if I was to solo that, then all we can hear is that reverb. Now what that means is, on a lot of the plugins, there's a dry-wet control, like this one here. And if you have it set to anything less than 100%, then you'll be still getting some dry signal coming through the return track as well. Now, as I said, you've already got dry signal coming from the main audio track, so you don't want that. You can get phasing problems. You just basically don't need it there. So you want to make sure with every send effect that you use, make sure that they're set to 100% wet. Now on my other return track, I have a filter delay. That doesn't have a dry-wet control. It has a dry volume control and then 3 separate volume controls for the delays. So in a way, they're kind of like 3 different wet controls. So all I do there is turn the dry down all the way. And that way, the only thing you're hearing is these 3 delays on the track. So basically, that's just one thing to remember when working with sends and returns. Now, other than that, you find all the audio effects here in the devices browser. You can see we've got an audio effects folder. And then all of the plugins themselves are listed individually. They've all got these little arrows next to them. And if you click on them, you can see the presets that come with Live for those plugins. You can either drag those directly to a track, or you can drag just the plugin to a track. Or if a track is selected, then you can just double click on them like this, and they will be inserted after the previous device on that same track. You also have this hot swap button here, which allows you to change presets more easily just by clicking on that. And then while that is active and you can see hot swap mode at the top here, then you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to switch between them and then hit enter when you're ready to change it. Or you can double click if you want to. So that's another way. You can just hit the escape key when you want to exit hot swap mode. So with insert effects, you can just keep adding them one after the other if you want to, but you have to remember, especially for DJing, if you're doing that on an audio track, then they'll always be going. So if you don't have a dry-wet control where you can turn it off like that, then like this plugin doesn't, then you kind of need to turn the plugin off or something, it can get a little bit complicated. So what I would advise doing to begin with audio effects is maybe go to this audio effect rack folder and have a look at some of the racks that come with Live. Now there's actually quite a big library of presets of effect racks. Now basically effect racks are racks of more than one effect plugin put together. So if we just load in this DJ master channel, or I've already got one loaded on this track, DJ Master Channel is a kind of useful plugin obviously for DJing. You can see we've just got 8 macro knobs here, and if you click on this button here, you can actually look inside at the devices, and you can see it's got an auto filter, reverb, EQ3 and saturator. And the controls of these plugins have been mapped to these knobs here, so that only the controls you kind of want most of all will be accessible to you. You can still control the other controls, you just have to open up and have the rack and have a look inside and do it that way. So that's kind of an easy and convenient way of just putting the controls you want most of all there with easy access. You can see here it's just got a volume control, saturation, so it can basically that's like a distortion, reverb decay, and a filter sweep, which if we just have a listen to maybe some of these. Filter sweep's a common effect for DJing, you'll probably have heard that a lot. And of course EQs, you need to have an EQ if you're DJing. We're going to look at EQ a bit more in the next tutorial. So really that's what I'd suggest doing, is just go through some of these effects racks. Like we saw before, you can use the hot swap button to switch between them if you want to. And you can try all the different effects racks and see how they work on your set. Some of them don't really have dry wet controls, so you'd need to turn them off. So you need to maybe think about that if you're putting them as insert effects. But if they don't have dry wet controls, then you might want to think about using them as send effects, because then you can use the send to only center them when you want to. And so other than that, I've got on the master track, I just have one effect plugin. I just use a limiter, and I just basically use that just to catch the peaks to stop this master track going into the red, because that's the last stage of the signal path before the amplifier. So if that goes into the red, then you can overload your amplifier or mixer, which means you'll get distortion and things like that. So I just put that limiter there just to catch those peaks. I don't bother with any presets. I just drag in the device itself directly to the master track, and that's all I put on the master. So really that's it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.